So I'd like to welcome everyone
She said wherever you'd like
to this wonderful event sponsored by the Institute for Research in African American Studies here at Columbia University. Our fearless leader is Farrah Griffin, and she's here tonight. This is Farrah, for those of you who don't know. And this afternoon, the University Senate voted unanimously to make our institute a Department of African American and Africana Diasporic Studies. So sorry about that, but yes. So it is a very historic day here at Columbia, and I'm glad that we are here to share in this success. We are celebrating 25 years of African American Studies here at Columbia. And tonight we are here to have a conversation, a roundtable discussion with Darnell L. Moore and his exciting book, No Ashes in the Fire, Coming of Age, Black and Free in America. I will introduce our panelists in a moment, but I'd first like to call your attention to our artists for this evening. We wanted to have a combination of artistic work and academic work, political activist work, and so we are very lucky to have Marcelle Davies Lashley. She's our featured musical artist this evening, and she's a psalmist extraordinaire. The sultry sound of the warm musical instrument of her voice will melt your heart and feed your soul. She was the sole fairy singer in A Midsummer Night's Dream at the Delacorte Theater. She has toured Paris and Turkey with Craig Harris and the Nation of Imagination. Marcel played the role of the Queen of Sheba in the national and international tour of Robert Wilson's opera, The Temptation of St. Anthony, by Gustave Flaubert, with the amazing libretto written by Dr. Bernice Johnson Reagan. Marcel, with her band, have set the stage on fire at the Brooklyn Academy of Music Cafe, the Schoenberg Center for Research in Black Culture, Harlem Stage, Lenox Lounge, the National Sawdust in New York City, the Ivory Room and Freight and Salvage in California, and a host of other places. She has a long and illustrious career that spans several decades, and we are so happy to have her here this evening to open this event. Accompanying Marcel on the keyboard is Marcus Lewis. Please join me in giving them a warm welcome.
I'm a little taller than Dr. Moore. The first song that I'm going to sing is called Ishe Oluwa, and it's what I like to call an African lullaby. Ishe Oluwa, kole baje wo. Ishe Oluwa, kole baje wo. Kole baje wo. Kole baje wo. Ishe Oluwa, kole baje wo. Weeping willow tree, tell me what you know. Rivers, were you crying? Many rains ago, weeping baobab tree lost her children to the sea. Rivers, were you crying? Many rains ago, Kole Baje, oh, goodbye, motherland. Kole Baje. Rivers, were you crying? Hey, rivers, were you have Marcus Lewis to join me on keys, and we're going to sing I Found God. No worries. No worries. You play. This is the first time he and I have done this song together. God's in no building, in no religion. There's no division when God is all you see. Search the world over. I found God in myself, you see, and I love her. It's been a journey across the 7 seas, and now I finally see the God in me. I look no further. I found God in myself, you see, and I love her. I found God. Do you hear? I found God. Do you hear? I found God. Do you hear? I found God. She's right here. It's been a journey across the 7 seas, and now I finally see the God in me. I dare not look any further. I found God in the eyes of you and me, and I am madly in love with her. I found God in the birds and the bees. I found God in the eyes of every one of you and me. I found God lovingly, tenderly. I found God, and she's right here. Don't look any further. Fearfully and wonderfully made you are, and me. I found God. Oh, tenderly holding you and me. I found God, and she's right here. Congratulations, Darnell.
Thank you. Let's give her another round of applause, both of them. Oh, that was just so beautiful. Such a nice mood for this evening. And for those of you who've read the book, you can completely see how her presentation is connected to what we're talking about tonight. Let's give them one more hand. Thank you. Wow, you know, I'm not an artist, and in IRAAS, well, I don't think of myself, in IRAAS, under the leadership of Farah, they really worked hard to bring art into what we do. And so I thought, well, this is what we do. So let's try this. And I was just so happy. It set such a nice energy for the room. So tonight we are really talking about Darnell Moore's book. And what I thought I would do is introduce him to you, for those of you who may not know everything about him. And we'll start with having him read just a few passages, or whatever he wants to read from the book. And that will give us a context for those of you who haven't had a chance to read it to understand the comments that will follow. So I'm going to introduce Darnell, and then I will introduce the speakers. I don't like to introduce everyone at once, because then when they talk, you don't remember who is who. And I want you to know everyone here and what they're sharing. So Darnell L. Moore, the author we're here to honor this evening, is head of strategy and programs at Breakthrough US. He is a co-managing editor of the Feminist Wire and a senior editor of the Feminist Wire book series and senior editor at Mike. Darnell has held positions of visiting fellow and visiting scholar at Yale Divinity School, the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality at New York University, and here at Columbia's Institute for Research in African American Studies. So we are very happy to welcome him back home. Darnell's advocacy centers on marginal identity, youth development, and other social justice issues in the U.S. and abroad. He assisted in organizing the Black Lives Matter's Ride to Free Ferguson in the wake of Mike Brown's tragic murder, and along with Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi, Black Lives Matter co-founders, developed the infrastructure for the BLM network. Darnell has received many, many accolades for this advocacy work. Here are just a few of them. The 2012 Humanitarian Award from the American Conference on Diversity for his advocacy in the city of Newark, where he served as chair of the LGBTQ Concerns Advisory Commission. The 2012 Outstanding Academic Leadership Award from Rutgers. The 2013 Angel Award from Gay Men of African Descent. He was named among Ebony Magazine's 2015 Power 100, Time Out New York's 8 LGBT influencers, and the Root 100 2016. I know I've seen some other things recently. I just couldn't include all of those. Those things. So No Ashes in the Fire is his first book, and we are thrilled to have him here at Columbia to talk about this truly, truly wonderful work. So join me in welcoming him, and he may open with whatever he'd like to say and to just read whatever he'd like to share with us.
Bios are so nerve-wracking. I just want to say thank you to you, Mignon, and to Yosef, and to Farah, and Sharon, and everyone at IRAAS and Columbia for making this night possible. It means a lot to me. And thank you all for being here on a Friday after 6 p.m. when happy hour calls. But it doesn't matter the number of people, it matters the spirit that's in the room. And I'm often, as I've been traveling around a lot, have discovered that this is probably, I don't know, my editor's in the back. I don't know what stop this is, but something over 35. And it's been a ride. But what I've discovered is that in every space where we can gather like this, it's been an opportunity for self-reflection and transformation. So thank you all for having me here on Friday. I'm tired, but my spirit is energized and rejoiced. So I'm grateful. And I want to say something about two little things. So the first song, Marcel's song, Ishe Ulawa, my teacher, Miss Dunham, between the grades of 6 and 8, that's the first song she made me sing in public. So this is how spirit works. So as I'm sitting here, I'm like, it isn't just about the sort of words of the song. It is the very song that I was forced to sing in public by my middle school teacher, who would keep me at her house and like keep me on the weekends without and by the way, I hadn't seen her all those years. She showed up at my book event in Camden 2 weeks ago. And I reminded her that she saved me from some really, really tough days. And she would bring me home to her house on the weekends and sit me behind a piano and make me sing. And little did she know, well, she did. Well, she would come to tell me that she did get a sense that I just needed some extra love and care. She's still around being her loving black woman self. So kudos to that, to Marcel, for reminding me about Miss Dunham. The second thing I'll say is just the power of community. I just want to acknowledge these two young brothers sitting in the front right here. I'm embarrassing them. But I just always, anytime I'm out, it means the world to me to see younger folk in rooms. So thank you, young brothers, for being, he's about to die right now because I'm doing this. But he also has a book. And I said, when I see you, I want you to bring your book. And I want it signed so that we can acknowledge the work that you do. So Tyler, who is a student here, first-year student, I'm calling your name out because now you got a crowd of witnesses that's going to watch you on campus to make sure y'all both are doing your work. Okay? So thank y'all for being here. I don't ever know what to read. And I actually haven't. You should see what this book is so dirty right now. But I've been reading the same thing, and it's a piece of the work that is about my father. And I should preface this by saying that a reader found my address somehow on the internet and sent me a 20-page letter saying to me that she's a spiritualist, and she said that I may have thought that my relationship with my dad ended when he died, but that it's only just beginning. I didn't read anything after that because I'm like, if you're going to write some words he said to me, I don't want to hear that yet. I think I got to page 5 and stopped, but bless your heart. So this is in honor of him. There were many nights I tried to skip bath time during my childhood. Even if my 7-year-old body smelled like outside, as my mom would say, I would leap into my bed without worry, smelling like a mix of grass, hot air, sweat, grime, and good times. The bathtub in our small 2-bedroom apartment felt too confining, and the way the water became sludge after I washed away the residue on my body, left from hours of play, repulsed me. I would move to the farthest end of any corner in the tub to avoid being touched by the once fresh water made dirty after washing. At some point, though, my dad had decided he had enough of my resistance. He loved the water. He swam with the grace of a bottlenose dolphin. When he went fishing, there was something about him that seemed to attract fish every time he released his pole. His brothers and sisters would tell me later that water was the element in which my father felt most disarmed and whole. One evening after dinner, my father called me into the bathroom. As I walked closer, I could hear the water hitting the bathtub floor with force. The door was slightly ajar as he stood in a tub lathering a washcloth with ivory soap. Black people love ivory soap. Open the door. What are you standing there for? He asked. I walked into the bathroom with as much annoyance as I did whenever I needed to wash. I'm about to teach you how to wash yourself properly. You can't be walking around here stinking. You're getting older and your body is changing, he said. And he prepared the wash rag and soap as if we were about to begin a legitimate class in proper cleanliness. I stepped cautiously into the steamy bath water. It was the first time I stood in the presence of my father when he was naked, which actually made me forget about how much I hated washing. It was mystifying to stand in the bathtub bare before the man who often veiled his deepest emotions and used the force of his physical power to dominate the spaces he moved through. I stared at him as he stood uncovered, more vulnerable and more self-possessed than I had ever seen him. He was 23 years old at the time, younger than I am now, but he was a father who was raising children. I can barely care for myself at 42, employed, relatively well paid, and cannot imagine all the tools he needed and lacked to properly care for me, my siblings, and me. Get all the way in the water, stop being scared. You gotta learn to clean your whole body, especially behind your ears and under your balls. He extracted me firmly, but with care and amusement as we squeezed our bodies into the tub. When we sat down, he moved his hand over mine. Together we grabbed the soapy wash rag and moved it across my neck, behind my ears, along my arms, and across my chest. My father gently washed my back as he instructed me on how best to clean the parts that smell the worst when boys play outside all day. My fear of the bath dissipated more and more after each repetition of calm instruction. offered amid safety in the presence of my father, who in other instances used the same hands to do damage. There was a lesson to be learned in the water. Bathing correctly was one lesson, but I also learned how tenderness and violence, care and harm are strange bedfellows. They can coexist in our complex web of human connections, the bad always canceling out the good, until the good that we are able to express smudges away the traces of evil even the best of us are prone to meet out. Looking back, I no longer see a young black father who was the totality of recklessness and lovelessness. I see a human being, a young black man struggling to transform what he otherwise used as weapons into instruments of care, his hands. His strong and soft hands were the source of contradiction in my youthful mind. His hands, his human and fragile hands, used gently and violently, now symbolize the complexity I too carry within and negotiate as an adult. In the water, we received instruction. And I just read the closing part of that chapter. I buried a man who was stuck. He was forever attempting to break away from the world of the black boy who didn't finish grade 8. The one who had a kid of 15, a boy who was pulled in by the lure of the streets, a teen who would later beat the girl he got beat up for protecting, a black man frozen in time. He was a black man who swung back when love sometimes showed up in the form of an embrace. We are the same. Like my father and so many other black men, some of us don't really ask for what we want, because to ask for love is to ask for what has been denied us for so long. How many of us want what we have been told we cannot or are not allowed to have? The last words I spoke over his unconscious body as he rested on a hospital bed, surrounded by the kids he had left long before, were simple. Fly. I know you are heavy. We forgive you. Whatever weights you have been carrying, let them go. Fly. I only told him what I learned to do in his absence.
All right, so that was beautiful. And the first part he read was earlier in the book. And I won't, tell you what happens, obviously, but it's that kind of writing that you experience in different ways as he progresses, and it's a joy to read. So I think we'll first hear. So let me just tell you how this is going to go. This is a roundtable discussion, even though we're not at a roundtable, and we will hear from each of the three presenters, and they'll talk for just a little while about one or two aspects of the book that resonated with them personally, or resonated with their work, or their scholarship, or their activism, or something that is representative of who they see themselves as in the world and their work in the world. And then we'll hear Darnell respond to that, just riffing. And then we will ask him some questions for him and for the other people on the table. And then we will ask for you to speak. I personally don't like when I go to events and I don't get to not necessarily me, but the audience doesn't get to connect with the people up here. I don't think it's nice to just be talked at. So we'll have hopefully a nice dialogue that for the final part of the event. So we'll begin with Kai M. Green, if that's all right. Yes? Okay. So let me introduce you to Kai. Kai is a shape-shifting black queer feminist nerd, an Afrofuture, freedom-dreaming, rhyme-slinging dragon slayer in search of a new world, a scholar, poet, facilitator, filmmaker, and an assistant professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at Williams College. An interdisciplinary scholar, Professor Green employs black feminist theory, performance studies, and trans studies to investigate forms of self-representation and communal methods of political mobilization by black queer folk. Kai is a proud member of Black Youth Project 100, BYP 100, and sits on the Healing and Safety Council. Please join me in giving Kai a warm welcome.
And Darnell said, I didn't say the best part, which is that we're birthday twins. So Aquarians are here.
We share the same birthday.
Thank you so much, Mignon, for inviting me. Thank you all for having me. It's an honor to be here to celebrate and honor my brother, Darnell Moore, who I believe we met through writing letters. I believe there was a time we had never set this way, and we had only known each other through sort of sharing in this group of folks who were Black and man, or identified as masculine, or yes. So we were trying to figure out, how do we cultivate discourses around how we love ourselves and how do we love other folks as Black feminists who may be identified as masculine. So I decided that I would read you a letter. So I wrote you a letter that is in response to the listening that I did on the way here.
That's such an Aquarius thing to do, right? Like,
and it's so funny because I literally was listening to this chapter on the ride here, the one that you read from. So, dear Darnell, thank you for the gifts of no ashes in the fire. It was a short sentence you wrote on page 162. She realized I was listening but not changing. That has been on my heart today. We live in a society that privileges that which we can see. To see is to know, but we know different. We know that being Black and queer and female and trans and working class and all that we may be, may have been, and could become or become again is never just one thing. This is the bind of double consciousness and the gift of second sight. Sometimes we just know better because we know more. We know ourselves, and we know the Eurocentric imaginations of ourselves, the images that get projected back onto us: sapphire, sissy, bulldagger, hoe, thug, nigger, mammy, welfare queen, boy, not child, monstrosity with crazy eyes and music way too loud, and we too swallow the thick syrup of anti-Blackness that constitutes this here present. The kind that made you believe that Camden's funk revealed some truth about your inherent outsider-outsidedness. You smell like the outside, your mother told you, but the outside is always in your skin when you're Black. Your Black skin demarcates the line between human and non-existence, premature death, but that is a half lie. Don't listen, dig up your roots. You did. And discovered the source of Camden's rank was sulfur, economic disinvestment and political exploitation, that which history disremembered, like Horatio Jimenez, the ghostly narrative webs that act as stage for your story. We have been made and are continually made to believe ourselves to be inherently wrong outside of history, but your book echoes June Jordan's declaration that wrong is not my name. It is not our name. Are you listening? Are you changing? Two important questions for a Black feminist. Are you listening? Are you changing? Thank you, brother, for the questions that might yield a fruitful unbecoming as you describe. When I left, I got on my knees to give thanks. I was finally prepared to live fully human. I had realized that the process of unbecoming the right kind of Black man would not kill me. No, it would be the road to unflinching liberty, good love, and livable life, and a more human self. I didn't know my return to the place where I ran from, my return home to Camden, would be the reason. Such is the power of the journey. Such is the eternal magic of so many Black, queer, and trans people summoned during our many world travels. Such is the power of the kind of self-affection that shows the erased their truest reflections. Such is the power of self-determination. To listen and not change is to waste time, and we have no time to waste. So how do we train our ears, our eyes, our whole full body, spirit, soul selves to stretch out in becoming more and becoming fully?
Okay, next on this roundtable, we will hear from Kim Ford, if that's all right. Okay. So Kim Ford is a dedicated and powerful freedom fighter. She has more than 20 years of experience working with grassroots, community-based, and national nonprofit organizations, including Fierce, Griot Circle, In Our Own Voices, Third Wave Foundation, Stonewall Community Foundation's Racial Equity Initiative, Racial Equity Initiative, and the Estrella Lesbian Foundation for Justice. Presently, Kim is the Interim Executive Director of the Audre Lorde Project, co-founder of Beyond Bold and Brave Black Lesbian Conference 2016 and 2018, and founder of Kitchen Table Giving Circle, a Black African descent, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and queer women philanthropic initiative. Kim has facilitated workshops and presented on various topics, including organizing in the LGBTST-POC communities, racism within LGBTST communities, and women's health, wellness, and sexuality. She also has an emerging coaching practice, so please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you. So, greetings, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. My first response was like, why am I here? What am I, I'm not an academic, I'm not a writer like you, I'm not an artist. I don't consider myself an artist. So, and then I started reading the book and felt a kinship I didn't expect to feel. I grew up in the Bronx I came of age in the 70s. So there is, the time you talk about in the book, I was already older. I was probably closer in age to your mother at that time. So in the Bronx, at the early stages of hip hop, that's what I grew up with. People figuring out families, kids, communities figuring out ways to make something out of nothing in a borough that is still neglected by the city and had been neglected, that had not quite had that reputation of being, the Bronx is burning or burnt out. That came a little later, but not realizing in a similar sense, growing up with middle class values, not knowing what was poor, even though we were. And even when there are parts in the book that resonated with me when you talk about your father, because I've always thought about my father once I became an adult, what he went through. He died young from diabetic complications, but he was also a violent man. And so knowing that he loved me, but at the same time could inflict violence and harm to me, was something that I had to deal with. And it wasn't until, and some things feel similar, right? That it was in my 30s that I actually forgave him. After some memories came back, and even now, there are memories that come back. So it felt almost like a parallel in a way of what it means to grow up a black child, but it's especially a black girl child, with my father's parents being from the South and living in Brooklyn, but growing up with my mother's parents who are Jamaican and being told we couldn't move from the front of the house, which wasn't a very big house, and more like a townhouse type situation, but my boy cousin could run wherever he wanted to. And from them, I started kind of figuring out that where I didn't fit in, where it didn't feel comfortable, where it didn't feel right, So I could say I was a feminist from then because it didn't work, right? These are the realizations you have. You don't have the words for them as a child, but you feel them and you know them, and you start pushing against that and saying, I can't stay here. So I mean, not the same things, but very similar, and realizing that we are some years, maybe a decade apart or so, but it felt the same. And it made me wonder, where are the young people who are still feeling that? Like, reading saved my life. Reading is what got me through. I didn't have a teacher or somebody to help me out. I had to help myself out. I was the oldest child. I was the oldest grandchild. I was supposed to be the leader. I didn't know what that meant. I was just like, I'm just going to keep my head down because I'm trying to stay out of harm's way. At the same time, but still having to conform, and spent a lot of years conforming to what it meant to be a girl child, a black girl child, being harassed on the street. And even now, it's interesting because this week has brought up so much, so whatever I thought I was gonna say has kind of shifted. And the relationship to my body has come up really strongly. There are, like, I work out just about every day. There are folks that, if you see my Instagram, you know that. But I just started thinking about why it was so important for me to be strong, to be agile, to be able to move quickly, to be able to duck, and not necessarily fight, but run. When we're taught to stand our ground, but run. Because running is about survival. Let's not forget, this is about being able to run and then build that strength and come back in number. And that's what, and that's what started shifting, and reading your book, and talking about Camden reminded me of the Bronx, reminded me of burnt out buildings and empty blocks and rubble, and what it means to grow up in a community that is so neglected. On one hand, you know that, and on the other hand, it's home. And then being bussed out of my neighborhood in second or third grade, and seeing another way of life, but still being jailed in a sense because we couldn't leave the schoolyard. So we were in the school with with white kids, but we couldn't leave the schoolyard. We couldn't go. They could go home for lunch. We couldn't. What does that mean? They went home when class was over. We waited for a bus to take us back. How much other could you be than to be told, shown every day that here's a neighborhood you can access temporarily, but you can't be there. So when I got to high school, I could have gone to a neighborhood, and I fought it to go to school in Manhattan because I knew there was more, that there had to be more. And that's what you were bringing up for me, is what's the more, what you're feeling inside that doesn't necessarily match up with what people see. What's the armor that you wear? What's that to keep yourself safe as you move through your life and you move through the world, and living dual lives in a sense. I am really struck. I mean, it's taken me longer to get through the book than I would have thought, because I'm getting these things, these little pieces. And if you look at the both of us, you wouldn't think there was any connection or anything that connected, other than we're both queer and black. But there is cute. Thank you. Because you are really cute. So, and fly. So let's just, yeah. So, but I think, actually I know, it opened my eyes, because even coming out, I came out in my 30s, and I came out in a room full of black lesbians with African ancestral lesbians, United for Societal Change, with Candace Boyce being my mentor. But this was a world that I didn't know. It's actually more of a connection to my father than I would have thought. And it's a connection to a male cousin I grew up with, and any male cousin around me that I hadn't thought about. Because if we were to put things in a hierarchy, I was at the bottom. And they were above me. In a Caribbean family, boys are loved and girls are raised. And what you showed me is to step even further, to not just think about my father and what he went through. And I still, to this day, feel he was an artist and didn't have a chance to become one. That life decided who he would be, and his fight against it showed up in violence. and you have given me even more insight, and I thank you for that. It also means that the love and care I have when I see young black men on the street now is even more. You know, like to not see young black men, no matter what they're wearing, as thugs, as criminals, as you know, a group to be feared. But what are they afraid of? What's happening to them every day? You know, how do I, if I am somewhere, what can I say to them? What is the look I can give them? What is the word that will put them at ease to know that I'm not going to clutch my purse in the elevator, that I'm not going to cross the street, that I see you as you are. So, and I thank you for all of this.
Thank you. We will now hear from Kendall Thomas. Kendall Thomas is the Nash Professor of Law and co-founder and director of the Center for the Study of Law and Culture here at Columbia. Professor Thomas's areas of expertise include U.S. and comparative constitutional law, human rights, legal philosophy, feminist legal theory, critical race theory, and law and sexuality. Among his many accolades, Professor Thomas was an inaugural recipient of the Berlin Prize Fellowship of the American Academy in Berlin and a member of the Special Committee of the American Center in Paris. Kendall is a founding member of the Majority Action Caucus of the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, which you may know as ACT UP, and the AIDS Prevention League. He is also the former member and vice chair of the Gay Men's Health Crisis Board of Directors. Please join me in welcoming Kendall.
Good evening, everyone. This is a real honor, and I'm very happy to be here. Darnell and I met 6 years ago. We were on an LGBTQ delegation to the occupied Palestinian territory. I did not know Darnell. I didn't know most of the people on the delegation, but we were the only two men of African descent. And my initial impressions have remained my principal impressions of Darnell. He's smart, he's sweet, he's sensitive, he's very sassy, and he's very courageous, all of which he tries to hide behind this claim that he's an introvert. But Darnell was one of the first people who volunteered to write the draft of the statement, the public statement that we issued as a group, as a delegation, about our experience as witnesses through this landscape of apartheid. And I was so grateful, as were the rest of the members of the delegation, that we had someone who was able to capture with the same power and penetrating insight that shines through every page of this book, the lives of the people whom we met in Palestine. I'm glad that you began by reading the passage of the book about your father teaching you how to bathe. Because when I read that, what came to mind was the insight of the late Marlon Riggs. It's a deep truth, and a truth that I'm certainly still trying to learn in my skin and to take in, and that is that black men loving black men is a revolutionary act. The love for black people, the unapologetic love for black people, which is on every page of this book, is only one of its many singular gifts. Darnell quotes a line from Toni Morrison in which she talks about emotional memory and the way in which emotional memory is, in her locution, a tricky force. Morrison is describing a phenomenon that the late British cultural theorist Raymond Williams described as in writing as a structure of feeling. Williams says it's not so much feeling as opposed to thought, but feeling as thought and thought as feeling. And that is another really compelling dimension of this work. Darnell writes at one point that this is the book that he wanted to read. And it's a book in a way that I felt like I want to continue to write for any number of reasons. The book is a memory machine. And as I was reading about, I was 19 when you were born. So I was already in my second year of college when you were born, and I grew up in a very small town in Northern California, in the northern tip of the Sacramento Valley, 70 miles northeast of Sacramento, about 8,000 people, principally agricultural, and I'd moved there with my grandparents. My grandfather was a Baptist preacher, and I moved there with my grandparents when I was 4, when he was called to pastor a church there. I was born, however, in East Chicago, Indiana, which is in the northwest tip of the state of Indiana. I would go back and forth during the summer. I would spend the summer with my mother's sisters. There were a bunch of them, and they would just pass me around from St. Louis to Gary, and from Gary to Indianapolis. But my favorite time was the time I spent with my grandmother's mother, Eva May, whom we call Big Mama. And I had these wonderful memories of her as I was reading about you, reading your book and your memories of your grandmother. You know, going to the White Castle, which we didn't have in California, and getting with my cousins, because I didn't have a lot of cousins in California, and my great-grandmother's custard pie and her fried green tomatoes, and the smell of mulberries, and the lady downstairs who would pass out from drinking cheap wine, and going to the Regal Theater to see Jackie Wilson, and listening to, you know, Martha and the Vandellas, my great-grandmother, who was a worldly woman, showing me her pearl-handled revolver, which she kept in the chifforobe, and my great-grandfather, who would have to take he would say, I'm going to lay down on the divan. And it was this wonderful world of family and of kinfolk that was more urban, because East Chicago was a city of about 28,000 people, and much poorer, much more visibly poor than the community in which I grew up in Oroville. Although we weren't rich. My mother inherited a house from her best friend, a coworker, Wanda, a white woman, in what was in an all-white part of town. And my brother and sister, my younger brother and sister, both went to. They integrated the school, the public school in that part of town. But then she lost the house after I went off to college, and so the story you told about that just resonated with me very powerfully. This memory machine. The book is a kind of memory machine that was for me a way to recover and to revisit these experiences, which, you know, the smell of peaches, of the peaches that we picked the first summer we arrived to make extra money, and the syrupy smell of the air when you're in a peach orchard. All these memories just flooded in on me, and that alone is a gift for me from reading this book. But alongside the experience of emotional memory, there's some very important teaching in the book. Darnell offers a fresh perspective on the feminist insight that the personal is the political. And this is a political memoir, not simply because Darnell Moore is an activist or an activist intellectual, but because he is mindful and keenly attentive to the political dimensions and the political determinations of personal life. We live in an age of memoir as a literary form, but one of the things that distinguishes this book from most memoir is the rigorous, I'm tempted to say almost relentless way in which it shuttles back and forth with a fierce determination and a kind of ethical commitment to connect his life, the lives of his family and friends on that little street in Camden, to the larger social structures, the larger structures of power in which everyday life on his block was embedded. So I found myself just moved almost beyond words as he talked about finding and excavating the archive of public records that described what as a young boy, that described in social terms what as a young boy he only knew as, the lives of this small community. And I'm struck too, and this will be my last point, because I don't want Mignon to nudge me with her elbow, by the way in which the book is an example in the genre of memoir of an observation that I first encountered reading the work of the late sociologist and social theorist Alvin Gouldner, who once wrote something. I was a young pup when I read this. So I can say it was over 40 years ago. You know how the old people used to say, I've been knowing so-and-so for 40 years. So this was an insight which came to me when I was very young from Alvin Gouldner, who wrote that the individuality of theory work is a socially sanctioned illusion. Right? And he goes on to say that all theory is not merely influenced by, but produced by a group. Darnell Moore knows that. Because in the subject position, that's a fancy word that Saidiya and Farah would use. The subject position of the book is not I, right, but it is we, right? And that is an indication not only of the fact that he's an old soul, which I intuited the very first time I met him, but that this is someone who, even though he rejects the idea emphatically, that this book is speaking for anybody but him, or that he can even speak for anyone else, recognizes that he contains within himself, to use Whitman's image, multitudes, right? A whole people has made Darnell Moore who he is. And I was reminded of old Brother Johnson back home in Oroville. He was a member of the Oro Vista Missionary Baptist Church, which my grandfather pastored. He was a man of whom some folks would say, we used to say, he couldn't read his name if he saw it in boxcar letters. But he used to say, go to school for the old people. And I used to, when I was a young kid, when I went to Yale College, these people who were in the senior choir that I had played for at my grandfather's church from the time I was 12 until I was 17 would send me $5 in the mail that they made cleaning white people's house. They didn't know the difference between Yale or jail. But they would say, go to school for the old peoples, right? And we have lost, all too many of us, have lost that intellectual and ethical grounding, that what we do individually is linked to the fate of the communities from which we come. That's one of the most pernicious effects, to my mind, of the sort of neoliberal cult of individual, I'm gonna get mine, right? Where we brand blackness, right? Without any real connection to black people, except insofar as we can monetize and profitize our association with blackness. And so, you know, Che said famously that the true revolutionary is guided by love. This is a revolutionary book. So it's not just a publication, it is an event. And so I would say to you, read this book, because through this book, you have an opportunity of finding the we that is in the I. Right? In this time when, you know, the unencumbered self, right? The person who is sort of self-sufficient, self-authorizing, self-sustaining is valorized as who it should be. I mean, I think one of the most pernicious things about the weak, anxious, inadequate ideology that we mistakenly call white supremacy, because it has nothing to do with supremacy. It is haunted by its realization that the privileges that it has are all about theft and criminality. Is that it has been able to persuade all too many of us that we don't need nobody else, right? And the South Africans got it right when they installed at the heart of their political and constitutional culture the Zulu notion of Ubuntu. People are people through other people. And so, you know, I learned so much about Darnell that I did not know. I told you I fell in love with him the first time I met him, but I love him more deeply. As a black man, as an intellectual, as an activist, as a brilliant spinner of prose, and as a deeply humane and human presence. So, you know, I will say again that this is a book that you should read, and there are copies in the back. I see. I'm gonna buy me one or two to give to people. So buy one for yourself, and if you have some money, buy one as a gift. I'm sure if you ask him, he'll sign it for you.
That's right.
But the book is a song. It's a sorrow song. It's a song of joy. It's hip hop. It's the blues, right? It's elegiac and exhilarating by turns, even, you know, in the space of a single page. And so for me, the intellectual and emotional gifts of reading the book will be more than amply rewarded by the time it takes you to work through its pages. So thank you, Darnell.
I'd like to give Darnell a chance to comment in any kind of way.
I'm just asking my editor back there, did you tape all of that? That was really, really beautiful. Really, really beautiful. I don't have a lot to say, but besides thank you. My gratitude is thick, really. Up until now, again, I've been in a lot of conversations where people are asking me my thoughts, and it's really great to sit down and for you to offer such critically generous responses. I'll start just by saying you said you learned so much about me. I learned so much about me too while writing. actually, this was a transcendent experience for me to write this book. I tell people all the time I didn't intend to write a memoir. That's not what I wanted to write. For the exact reason of, I think the way that memoir as a genre can be misread and misapplied. That is, a person sort of writes themselves in as a hero or a villain, or victim, and never villain. Hero or victim, and what I really wanted to do was to, as Joan Morgan would say, a bit like play in the gray. And so much of what the process of self-reflexive analysis, the process of thinking about the ways that I had learned to make monsters out of the people in my life, like my father, and having to sit with the ways that it was easy to make him into a monster, because it allowed me to distance myself from the monstrosities within. It did not allow, it allowed me to do things like not to name him as a really, really bad guy. I would say things like I hated him. I prayed once that God take him or me, until I sat down and I was writing this book. And I kept thinking, we are cut from the same cloth. I think I say something like, I am in his ellipses. That is, the same social structures, the ideas that he took in, the streets that we walked down, the same people that called him Sweet Daddy and Boo Boo. Sweet Daddy. Imagine somebody naming you Sweet Daddy at 14 and you have a kid the next year. Imagine what type of way that will sort of structure your understanding of boyhood and manhood. That same structure was my structure too. And in writing the story, and in his dying, in the midst of me writing this story, I was forced to confront the many ways that the same hands that had shaped him had shaped me too. And my queerness could not save me from that shaping. And in fact, it was something that I learned to do, but I ended the book. In fact, the writing of the book allowed me to eulogize him. I often told folk I'm his only, how this goes. I was like his oldest son, oldest child, and only son. So there's already this idea, like I'm supposed to be ready to preach him good when he is ready to transition. And the only reason I was prepared to do that and to do so in such a way that it complexified him is because of this writing process, which broke me, really did. But what I also was really moved by is this notion of love that is sort of weaved through what all of you said. But I was thinking about love, but I was also thinking about lovelessness. Lovelessness is a type of fire, a type of fire that we learn to, some of us, survive in the midst of, and some of us survive in the midst of it, and some of us don't. Lovelessness, or the fire, is also America. And I kept thinking, well, what does it mean to give the thing that has been withheld you? Which brings me to your point about black men. Loving black men is a revolutionary act, or black people. Loving black people is a revolutionary act because it's revolutionary because you're actually given a thing that has been withheld you. And I'm not just talking about ideologically, but I'm talking about like through the nation's policies, its legislation, laws, the practices, the traditions, the everyday sort of rudiments of like being black and on the streets. So this is not Hallmarkish love I was interested in exploring, right? But the type of love that materializes itself, or the type of lovelessness that materializes itself into a space that turns out looking like Camden. And Camden doesn't look like Camden because black people just happen to be there. But that there's a long history that people work so hard to hide from folk like me who grew up there, that didn't reveal what I call the invisible hands doing their best work unseen, but felt. The streets you grow on smell like shit. Somehow you figure out that the shit smell is coming from the municipal waste treatment plant that's 2 blocks away from your house. What they don't tell you is that the shit that's being sent there is coming from the white people's suburban areas. And that the county voted on that. And that the way that the city was able to sort of acknowledge that as something that is to be applauded is because they got some tax breaks and got some dollars in. But they don't tell you that shit smell and the waste that's being treated in your neighborhood, you smell it. We know it's there, but we don't always have the words to call it environmental racism, right? We don't name it. We don't have, and this is what I wanted to get to this point, that our people get it. That people like my family in Camden, even without having access to the language, had analysis. They had an awareness. They understood the sort of the flesh that was not only on their own skin. They understood the bodies that they were in, but they also understood the body that was the city that was being racked, that was being destroyed by so many people. We were told often that, everybody told me about Camden and how they would always give these glory stories about Camden's heyday when all of the department stores were there, when people could go out and go shopping, and they had movie theaters, and then the black people, they would say, burned it down. But they didn't tell you why you burned it down. They didn't tell you, like in most post-industrial, mostly black and Latinx cities, people were rioting in the late 60s and early 70s. In this case, in 1971, they rioted because you can guess, probably all of you could guess why. Police officers, if I say police officers, guess, they killed somebody, yeah? They killed a Puerto Rican brother. And like my family, who put the red, black, and green tag on front of their house to signal, like to pass over, that this is one of the houses you don't burn down because we black, we're brown like you. This is why the people burn. But nobody ever told me that. Nobody ever told me that. Like, I had to go and search for those things. I was an inquisitive kid. And I kept thinking, I know this shit can't be that bad just because we here. I know it can't just be bad because we're here. You can't be. So the white people moved out, and all of a sudden, Walt Whitman's invincible city. Because Walt Whitman's house is still there, very protected. But this idea that Walt Whitman's invincible city is somehow only what it is because of the blacks and the sort of culturally pathological strain that was somehow here because of their presence. I tried to use narrative to challenge that idea. One of the only histories that I read of Camden is a newer book that came out by Howard Gillette. And that was probably within, I don't even know, maybe within the last decade. And that is to say, like, having grown up there, I never ever saw or read a history of my city at all. One that challenged the prevailing narrative that was present in them. Isn't that, like, that's the first time, last week was the first time that I went back to the city, that same house that I talked about where the shit smell was, and did a book reading a block away from the house I grew up. Here's something interesting about it. I did a book reading at what used to be a firehouse. It's now owned by a white woman. There's a lot of white people at this reading in 2018. And these same areas, this is a story that we know too well, right? But these same areas that politicians they sort of allowed this flourishing rhetoric to sort of be produced and pretty much maintained within mass media about the neighborhood that I grew up in, all of the neighborhoods really, was utilized for the specific reason of bringing in a certain type of dollar and a certain type of corporate interest that's now back in that city, and the people that grew up there aren't. So I felt like a stranger visitor going back. But again, this is the mundane nature and everydayness of like what it means to be black in urban spaces that are post-industrial, like Camden and Gary, Indiana, and all of the places we named here. But what's the more? And that's the question that you mentioned, and part of what I've come to understand as radical black love, and I say radical black love, and I modify love there on purpose, despite somebody, like I was on a talk with Bell Hooks who said, what, Darnell? It's love. And I said, no. It's black love. Particularly when love and these ideas like love and justice and freedom are empty rhetorics when used within the context of the American empire. And I think they need to be modified. That being said, like one of the first places I learned the sort of notion of like radical love is in my family, my people. They taught me everything I know about feminism before I knew what feminism was. They taught me everything I know about, pushing back against all of these structures, these quote unquote systems, before I had an understanding of what those structures and systems were. And they did this in very basic ways, and this is the way I describe it. When I come from the type of family that we didn't have a lot, we often lived in houses that were at least 2 or 3 bedrooms, basement, sometimes finished, sometimes not, and the houses were always packed, because my mom at some point was single, and we ended up at my grandparents' house once when our house was destroyed by a boyfriend of hers. At the same time that my aunt, who had moved off to the suburbs, they thought she was a good one, She made it to the suburbs with her husband. She moved to the suburbs and she had a husband. That was a feat. And she graduated from Catholic school and went to college. So this was like a big deal for them. But even they had to come back home after they lost their home. So my mama, single, had me at 16 with her kids who only finished 10th grade. We all laying on the floors, aunts upstairs, uncles downstairs. This house was packed. And some of the people in the house were the type of family members that stole shit from you 2 weeks before, or had just gotten out of jail, or did some foul shit. But they never let anyone go. No one was ever houseless. Everybody had a place to stay, even if we were sleeping on each other. Everybody always had food to eat. And that, to me, is a type of pushback against disposability. Unlike nothing I've ever seen. So you talk about abolitionist politics. We like to use this language. And what it means for us to not do to each other what the system does to us. A system that is at the ready for disposability when it comes to black people. And it was my black family who had the monsters, the folk that can't give you anything, the people that fell from grace, the failures, all in their home, and loved the hell out of them. Far before I started organizing or becoming an activist, this then becomes the ground for how I understand a politic. And it challenges me in moments like this, where disposability is a sort of carceral responses to things is the rule of the day. I come from a family for whom that was just not a possibility. I don't know how they forgave each other. Look, I don't know what type of families y'all come. I'm just gonna keep it very real. I just would sit there like, Grandma, like, how you let her in? Like, we did lock stuff up, and we did change, which is not to say that accountability was not a part of that love, because it was, which is not to say that grace was offered as cheap grace. It wasn't cheap grace that was offered. This was something that was very real. So there's that, and I wanted to sort of to make sure that was very much felt throughout the book. The last thing I'll say is to your point about becoming and unbecoming. I learned, and one of the things I'm grateful for, particularly as a person who is understood and interpreted as a man in this moment in time, is that the best thing for us to do, and I borrow this from Hal Sam's Queer Art of Failure, really, Jack's book, unbecoming is freedom. Particularly when we have to sort of break away or break out of or abolish so many of the cages, these identity categories and ways of being that we are told we are all to strive to fit ourselves into. And that was really important for me to name, because so much of my anxiety had to do with becoming the type of black man that society told me I needed to be. And that's that's a painful, it's a violent, it's a stressful battle. and it's a stressful journey. But to finally look at oneself and say, oh, no. That's not, like, so even now to this day, people tell me I tell folk I don't want to become a better black man or practice a sort of more redeemable masculinity. I don't say those things anymore. And I often try not to even say better it's nice to say the universal. I want to be a better human. But then when you black, what the hell does that mean? I'm just like, I just want to be free, actually, from all of those ideas. I want to unbecome. And I had wished that I had access to that freedom, to that failure so much earlier on, because I probably would not have spent 2 decades of my life trying to take myself out of here, because of the anxiety that comes along with becoming. So I'll stop there, but thank you all for the generous responses, for carefully reading. I will say that I did 2 things that I wanted when writing this book, and Katie is in the back, can attest to this. I wanted black people to read this and be proud. And that's the first thing. And the second thing is, in my head when I was writing to like black young people. So all of the other things that have come as a response is, it's a bit overwhelming, and just reminding me of literally what it means for us to think beyond like the neoliberal eye. And even with the genre of memoir right now, what it means for this genre to be structured in a way that it is in this moment too. I think there are so many important things I'm learning, and I'm overwhelmed with the best type of gratitude possible, that folk can read this and somehow see ourselves in it.
Okay, in our last few minutes, we're going to open this up for you as the audience who want to share something with Darnell, ask a question or a comment. I will say that geography features prominently in this work in a way that's very refreshing and original, in terms of home, school, college, the streets of Camden and Philly, and Darnell's use of space. He's telling a memoir, but he's doing it in these very interesting and original ways. Even when he talks about family, he takes great care in describing and analyzing those relationships. And he's very reflexive. He mentioned reflexive self-analysis. But one thing I think, for those of you who haven't read it, or if you have read it, the intersectional nature of the way he presents himself. He's always talking about what he's doing, but also analyzing what he's doing and relating it to us and to black people. And so that is something that I think you will find useful. I personally intend to teach this work in my Sociology of African American Life lecture, in my Gender and Inequalities in Family seminar. In my favorite chapter, I think it is chapter 6, Unbecoming, and he was talking about that here, becoming and unbecoming. And, we didn't talk much about, I feel we didn't talk much about his sexuality and wrestling. He was wrestling with it. And you see that wrestling here. And he says, I was of 2 minds, torn apart by 2 inherent beliefs, an awareness of my human worth and a denial of my sexual difference. I struggled to affirm and love the parts of myself I rejected and hated. And so he's really deep. I mean, he's fun. You get to hear about his loves and crushes and people he wants to have sex with and people who has a crush, who, mistakes he made as a young adult, the teen. And, it has that kind of memoir feel. And that's fun. And I do think all people will relate to those stories. I think it is a special thing he gives to black folks and black queer folks in the ways that he writes it. But he contextualizes it with serious experiences. He brings in the historical part. So there's just so many levels to the work. And so what did you experience when you read the work, or what are you interested in learning more about if you haven't read it yet? Oh, I also want to say that the bookseller has to leave after Darnell finishes. Oh, he has to leave, I guess, soon. So you can step over there and get your book while we still talk, because I do think it's important for you to, okay. Yeah, so it's very informal, but you can share with Darnell, and you can also buy your books.
Mic check, mic check. Say no. No, I'm really interested in. So after reading your book, I know you talk a lot about your sexuality and what that's like. I myself growing up in the Black church and what that's like. I know it can be very, very homophobic at times, and kind of learning to love God and kind of doing that, but also having to navigate that with your sexuality. I want to know kind of where you are now. And like, how have you come back to that? And what is that experience like? If you've come back to that, I don't want to presume, but I'm really interested in that.
Yeah,
that journey.
Such a good question. I often, when I'm out, I shy away from that question so much because I feel like it requires so much nuance. Where I am now, a big part of what I had to do, and I say this in a lot of different places, I felt like I had to do away with the God image, the God concept that had been given to me. All of the things that had been taught, I had been taught, the theologies, the sermons that were preached behind the pulpit, all of the messages I internalized, I had to challenge them, and I had to funeralize them. And I'm using that term because for so many of us, I can't speak for many people. Let me just give you a sense of my back. You know this from reading, but I grew up in a very Pentecostal, fundamentalist, Bible, every word of the Bible is God-breathed and right type of church in Philly. Apostolic church, that's even more, that's like, y'all don't need to, okay, like, you got to get baptized in the name of Jesus. Look, it was deep, okay? Right. To get to a point where I said, you know what? There are theologies that heal and there are theologies that kill. Much of my depression and the sort of suicidal ideation had everything to do with the way I internalized the messages that were being preached. So I'm not going to say I just woke up one day and this happened. I mean, I went to seminary. That was a lifesaver. Before I went to seminary, I did a degree in clinical counseling. Actually, because the theology I was being taught had everything to do with the sort of sense of self-deprivation, self-hatred that I was dealing with in my 20s. So I went to get the degree in clinical counseling to save myself first. I went to seminary to get tools to ask questions about what I had been taught. Now, I'm grateful for the theology, like Black liberation theology, the work of so many people under that tradition, of Black women, feminist, womanist scholars who offered me a new way to think about God, to think about religiosity, to not only challenge the presumptions that were made about sexuality, to not only help me to think about biblical interpretation differently, but to also help me to understand like the white supremacist colonial roots that were at the heart of a lot of the theologies I was taking into. I'll give you a story, and maybe this can help illuminate like my transformation. I had, I told you I grew up in like the holiness. It literally was called the holiness church. Like you shouted and danced, like y'all know. Okay, it was a thing. I had a friend of mine, holy too. They say like fire baptized. So, he called me one day, and I said, "I'm gay." And he said to me, "Aren't you afraid of going to hell?" And I said to him, if hell is where I'm supposed to go for being honest about the fullness of myself, then that's where I want to go. Because if you're telling me heaven is my entrance into heaven is going to be by virtue of me lying or withholding my truth or diminishing myself, then I don't want to be in a place where liars are. And it doesn't seem to me that God, who we call love, who we say represents love, would be so small as to want that, right? That was a key moment in my life. I made a choice, me personally, to leave spaces that did me violently, that harmed my spirit. And I don't always encourage people. For some people, my worshiping community was my family. So when I left my church, I broke relationships with hundreds. Like, I went to a church that was 20,000 members. I was very active. When I left my community, it meant that I sacrificed those relationships over my self-healing. Hardest thing I've ever done. But I'm alive today because I did that. What I don't do is ever rush people to make that type of choice, because there's a cost to that. But what I will say is that we do deserve to be surrounded by communities of care that see us, that support us, and that lifts us up, and that is not doing us wrong, doing us violently.
I do think that that is something that Darnell does a great job of in the book, which is talking about how he understood God and his relationship with the church and God, and the harm that he experienced as a result of the ways he understood that relationship, and how that changed for him. So, if you know people who are struggling with that, I think this is a great book for them to read, because I think people can see themselves in his struggle and how he overcomes that struggle.
And I should note too, then, and not just harm that was done to me. I stood behind pulpits and preached homophobic sermons. Even as I mean, that's just real. Like, I'm talking about, I don't want to be too explicit, but like, I just spent the night with a guy that I love and get up in a pulpit and preach some people to hell. So there's that too, right? Like the way that so much of that homo, queer, antagonistic, trans antagonistic, human antagonistic theology, it was in me, and it's sort of like you have to exercise it in so many ways. So I just want to be honest about that. I don't want to act as if I was not also complicit in maintaining the type of cultures that did people wrong, because I was too.
And he lays that on the table in the book. He lays these things that he sees as hypocrisies, or he sees as two sides of the same coin. He lays them out in a way that, so that's why I think people can relate to it, because he doesn't hide that. He doesn't, gloss over it. In different areas of your life, you do that. You talk about that with women, with God, with patriarchy in the church, and how he benefited from that. Just a really thoughtful. It's a memoir, but it's so thoughtful, and so it offers you analyses that you can take for your own life. Other comments you want to share with him?
I just wanted to say thank you for this offering. I'm really curious to know more about your healing work, and you talked a little bit about the emotional labor that this project has brought up for you, and I'm curious to hear more about the continuum of that. Yeah. Like, what's on the horizon?
Oh, wow. That healing work it's never, healing isn't like a destination. I am a different person on this side of the book than I was before I started it. That process was one of I was seriously broken in the best way possible. A couple of things that I think I've tried to do, and that is to develop a community of care And, I've wrote in community, really, and with people who could make themselves available. We could make ourselves available to each other. So that's been super helpful, like to be writing and sort of breaking around people who can make the space, the holding environment for me, for us. I've actually returned to some spiritual practices, believe it or not. I feel like if anyone knows me, you probably know that that's a feat, to pray again and meditate. So that has been super helpful to connect to my ancestors in ways that are really clear. I told you about this letter that was written to me by a spiritualist, 20 pages of just like, I didn't read it all, but it was clear to me that my ancestors were present, are present, and are communing, and that's been super helpful. And I've been learning so much through their help. But another thing too, some basic things. I haven't had a TV in about a year and a half. Haven't watched, and I don't have a TV in my, you would know that's a feat. Like, somehow the wall, I had an electric fire, it like sizzled the wires of my TV, and I'm just lazy and never got it fixed. So it's not, I didn't even do this on purpose. I would love to make y'all feel like I did this on purpose. I didn't. The TV is still on my wall. Thing don't come on. I ain't changed it. And because of the TV's not on, I let my Wi-Fi is not even on. So in my home, I just be sitting there. So while y'all like wilding out on Twitter, I'll just be at my house. Like, I don't have access to nothing. I'm just going to sit here and drink this wine and just get drunk. That's helped me. It's helped me a lot, particularly because of the work that I've done over the last several years in media, which was not the healthiest for my spirit. There are people that can pontificate with every sort of specter of black death. It just was not helping me. So to be in my home now alone a lot, where me and my silence and my thoughts, it's been it's so good. So those things are really been really, really critical to me. And then the last thing I'll say is my family. In writing this, I was sharing as I write with my mother and my sisters. And for a family like mine, who's really good at showing love, but not always good at being honest about our brokenness, and being honest about not being okay, this has allowed us to do that in ways that we've never experienced before, and that is remarkable. I mean, it gets a little. I laugh a lot now because folk call me up and they're like, "Well, let me tell you what happened when I was 2." And I'm like, okay. I can't, I swear to you, I have to turn my phone off sometimes. It gets a little too much. But there is that type of, this gift that they're allowing themselves. And I come from a type of family where, things happen. You just get up the next day and we keep going. And I just want them to know that, yeah, we're good, but it's okay sometimes not to be. It's okay. And that in so many black families, I think, is a gift to experience. And that's been part of the healing process too.
Okay, so we're just about out of time. What I'd like to do for this last segment is have you come up if you want to meet Darnell, if you haven't met him. And I know there was some signed copies that you might have purchased, but maybe you want him to write something in your book. And I think he said he's willing to do that. I do also want to make this announcement if I can. Kendall Thomas is going to be performing at Joe's Pub on Sunday, October 21st. It says Autumn Leaves, a Nat King Cole songbook.
Yes.
And there's a show at 4:30 and there's a show at 7. If you want to go, there's some information on the back, what he's doing. It's his He's returning to Joe's Pub for the first time since his 2017 debut, and he sings and he plays the keyboard. Okay, so I think that this sounds quite interesting, and I'm going to try to get my sitter so we can have a go out. But please come and pick one of these up when you come up to say hello to Darnell. Thank you very much for coming tonight, and we appreciate you. Thank you. So come on up and talk to him and pick one of these up.